The letter that revealed Jack the Ripper. Chapter 1. The letter arrives. The letter reached Scotland Yard on the morning of the 30th of September, 1888, and it arrived not by ordinary post, but tucked inside the breast pocket of a dead man. Constable Henry Marsh discovered the body at 4:20 in the morning, during his final circuit of Lamont Street before the shift change. The man lay in the narrow passage between a tallow chandler's shop and a collapsed section of brick wall near the junction of Commercial Road, face upward. Arms folded across his chest with an almost ceremonial precision that no accidental death produces. He was well dressed by Whitechapel standards. A wool frock coat, moderately polished boots, a collar that had once been white. No wounds were immediately visible. No blood darkened the cobblestones beneath him. He simply lay there in the blue pre-dawn darkness, as though someone had arranged him for viewing. What stopped Marsh's blood was not the body itself. It was the envelope protruding from the dead man's breast pocket, addressed in a precise, educated hand to Detective Inspector Edmund Carver, Criminal Investigation Department, Scotland Yard. Marsh did not open it. He blew his whistle and stood guard, listening to the foghorn moan of a barge somewhere on the invisible Thames, while Whitechapel stirred around him, a dog barking, a child crying 2 floors above, the distant, rhythmic clank of the early tannery workers beginning their shift. By the time his sergeant arrived, Marsh had counted 17 gaslight halos dissolving in the fog above Commercial Road, and he had decided, without knowing precisely why, that the letter was the most frightening thing he had encountered in 4 years of East End policing. He was correct. Detective Inspector Edmund Carver arrived at Leman Street Police Station at 6:30, having been pulled from a dreamless sleep in his lodgings on Cable Street by a constable who knocked with unnecessary force and spoke with entirely too much excitement. Carver was 41 years old, a lean, carefully constructed man who wore his thinning brown hair combed back with geometric precision and his exhaustion like a second coat. He had been assigned to the Whitechapel murders investigation since the beginning of September, which meant he had slept perhaps 30 uninterrupted hours in the past 4 weeks and had developed a persistent tremor in his left hand that he concealed by keeping it in his coat pocket. The investigation had broken 3 good men already. Detective Sergeant Frederick Aberline, borrowed from Scotland Yard's central office, was brilliant but increasingly erratic, prone to fixed ideas, he pursued, with a ferocity that occasionally blinded him to contradictory evidence. Inspector Walter Andrews was methodical but politically entangled, spending as much energy managing communications upstairs as conducting actual detective work. And Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the divisional surgeon who had examined the murdered women, had grown visibly smaller with each post-mortem examination, as though the crimes were slowly consuming something essential in him. Carver had so far maintained his equilibrium by the simple practice of refusing to imagine the victims as anything other than evidence. He was honest enough with himself to recognize this as a professional deficiency masquerading as professional detachment. He thought about it sometimes at 3 in the morning, in the particular darkness that follows a case that refuses to resolve, and he disliked what he concluded. He examined the dead man first, before touching the letter. The deceased was identified, through papers in his coat, as Mr. Thomas Wickfield, aged 53, described on a visiting card as Commission Agent Aldgate. Phillips, who had been retrieved from his own interrupted sleep, established within 20 minutes that Wickfield had died of heart failure, genuine cardiac arrest, no marks of violence, no poison immediately detectable. He had simply died, possibly walking, and been arranged afterward by someone who found him or accompanied him. Or he had been walking with someone who ensured, by means Phillips would not specify without further examination, that the heart failed precisely where and when it did. "Is it possible," Carver asked, "to frighten a man to death? Deliberately enough that a doctor might read the result as natural?" Phillips looked at him for a long moment. Theoretically, a profound shock, extreme cold combined with exertion, certain psychological. He stopped. "I'm speculating." "Continue." "If a man with a weakened heart were brought into a state of extreme terror while standing in a cold passage in the early hours of a wet morning, the resulting cardiac event might be indistinguishable from an ordinary natural death. Theoretically." Carver turned the envelope over in his hands. The address was written in black ink, the letters formed with the measured confidence of someone educated not merely in literacy, but in penmanship as an art, a boarding school hand. he thought. Or possibly illegal training. The envelope had been sealed with plain wax, no impression. He opened it at Lemon Street Station, seated at the duty sergeant's desk, while 3 constables pretended to be occupied with paperwork across the room. The letter was a single page, written on quality cream notepaper, bearing no watermark he could immediately identify. The same educated hand. It read, "Dear Inspector Carver, you have been searching for me with commendable diligence, and I have watched your efforts with genuine admiration. You are the most intelligent man assigned to this investigation, which is perhaps why you remain the furthest from the truth. The women I have taken from Whitechapel streets were not chosen at random. Each was selected according to a principle that your colleagues have entirely failed to perceive because they are looking for a monster, and I am not a monster. I am a corrective mechanism. I am a physician treating a disease, and you will understand this statement precisely when you understand what connected them. The letter you are holding arrived with a dead man. Mr. Wickfield was not murdered. He was frightened. He became acquainted with me 3 nights past, and the shock of that acquaintance proved, unfortunately, more than his constitution could withstand. I regret this. It was not my intention. But it does rather demonstrate the effect my proximity can have upon the unprepared. I am writing to offer you a single opportunity. There is a clue you have already seen, already touched, already filed in your evidence boxes whose significance you have not yet grasped. When you understand it, you will understand everything. I will give you 1 fortnight to find it. If you have not found it by the 14th of October, I will take another. Until then, I remain your devoted student of human nature, J." Carver read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it, replaced it in the envelope, and sat quite still for approximately 90 seconds while the duty sergeant's clock measured the silence. "Send for Aberline," he said finally, "and I want every piece of physical evidence recovered from the previous scenes brought to this station by noon. Every boot print casting, every fiber, every scrap of paper, every item recovered from the victim's clothing, every letter received by the press or the central office, everything. Sir, some of that material is at—" "Everything," Carver said. "By noon." The morning newspapers arrived at 7:30, and with them came the particular species of chaos that the Whitechapel murders had made routine. The Star had somehow obtained information about Wickfield's death. Not the letter, apparently, but the death itself and the manner of its discovery, and had published 3 paragraphs under the headline, "Ripper's New Victim. Mysterious death in commercial road passage body found arranged with unnatural precision." The Daily Telegraph was more restrained, restricting itself to a front-page column about the mounting public outrage over the Metropolitan Police's continued failure to apprehend the killer. Outside Lehman Street Station, a crowd had gathered by 8 o'clock. Carver could see them through the window, men in laboring clothes, women in shawls, children who should have been in school or already in the factories, all standing in the damp morning air watching the police station, with the collective expression of people who have concluded that their protectors cannot protect them. He recognized among them the broad-shouldered figure of George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, speaking earnestly to several other men. Lusk's committee had been conducting independent street patrols for weeks. They were well-intentioned and occasionally obstruction, and Carver had, on 3 separate occasions, found it necessary to have polite but extremely firm conversations with Lusk about the boundaries between civic duty and evidence contamination. He watched the crowd and thought about the letter. The most intelligent man assigned to this investigation, which is perhaps why you remain the furthest from the truth. The arrogance of that line was strategic, he decided. It was designed to sting, to provoke, to make him feel personally challenged, and therefore to make the investigation personal. A personal investigation was a compromised one. He recognized the manipulation precisely and found, with some private dismay, that it was working anyway. A clue you have already seen, already touched, already filed. He had personally handled evidence recovered from the scenes of 4 murders. The canonical Whitechapel murders, his thinking automatically applied the term his colleague Aberline had coined internally to distinguish what appeared to be the primary sequence from the broader cluster of violent deaths in the pond. Area had accumulated a collection of physical evidence that was simultaneously substantial and maddeningly inconclusive. There was the apron fragment discovered in Goulston Street, bearing the controversial chalk inscription that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner had ordered wiped away before it could be properly photographed, destroying what might have been the most significant piece of evidence in the entire investigation. There were the women's possessions, their pitiful accumulations of daily life. There were the medical reports, the boot impressions, the door-to-door witness statements that contradicted one another so comprehensively as to be nearly useless. And there was something else, something that Carver had noted and filed and not yet had the mental space to fully examine. A detail from the post-mortem examination of the fourth canonical victim that Phillips had mentioned in passing and then moved past, and that Carver had marked in his notebook with a small asterisk. He opened his notebook to that page now and read the line again. Before he could pursue the thought, the station door opened and Detective Sergeant Aberline entered, his overcoat wet from the continuing drizzle. His eyes carrying the particular brightness of a man who has slept too little for too long and whose mind is running on something beyond ordinary energy. "The body in the passage," Aberline said immediately. "I've been told there was a letter." "Close the door," Carver said. Aberline read the letter standing up, his stillness increasing as he progressed through it. When he finished, he set it down on the desk with a care that suggested he was conscious of not wanting to damage it. "He's writing to you specifically," Aberline said. "Not to the press, not to the commissioner. To you." "I noticed." "Why you?" It was the correct question. Carver had been asking it since he first read the letter. He was not, by his own assessment, the most prominent figure in the Whitechapel investigation. That distinction belonged to Aberline, whose name appeared regularly in the press. He was not the highest ranking. He had no particular public profile. Yet the letter had come to him, had been placed in the pocket of a dead man with his name precisely written on the envelope. "He's been watching the investigation from close proximity," Carver said. "He knows who is actually directing the evidential analysis. He knows things that haven't been published." "That suggests—" "Yes," Carver said. "Someone with—" "Yes." They sat with that implication for a moment. "The 14th of October, Aberline said. "That's a fortnight from yesterday." 13 days, Carver said. "He's given us 13 days to find a clue we've already seen and already missed." He picked up the letter again, studying the handwriting, and he knows we have it, which means he also knows precisely what it is. He turned the letter over. In the lower right corner of the back of the page, nearly invisible against the cream of the paper, was a small symbol he had initially taken for a printer's mark or a random ink smear. It was not either of those things. It was a tiny, precise drawing no more than a centimeter across of a compass rose, 4 cardinal directions, rendered with extraordinary miniature care. Carver had seen that symbol before. He had seen it on the evening of the 8th of September, on a scrap of paper recovered from the clothing of Annie Chapman, the second canonical victim, which had been catalogued, photographed, and placed in an evidence box at Commercial Street Station. A compass rose, tiny, precise, drawn with the same educated hand. He had marked it in his notebook with an asterisk and moved on, because at the time he could assign it no significance. He could assign it significance now. "Aberline," he said quietly, "I need you to go to Commercial Street Station immediately and retrieve item 14 from the Chapman evidence catalog." Aberline was already reaching for his coat. "What is it?" "A piece of paper," Carver said, "with a drawing on it." He looked up from the letter. "And I think it may have been placed there deliberately for us to find. For me to find." The clock on the duty sergeant's wall ticked into the silence. "He knew Annie Chapman," Carver said. "He knew her well enough to put something in her pocket that he intended me to find 3 weeks later." Outside, through the rain-streaked window, the crowd on Lemon Street had grown. Somewhere in the grey morning fog of Whitechapel, beneath the same drizzle darkening the same cobblestones, among the same frightened and hungry and exhausted people who filled these streets every dawn, walked someone who had written a letter to Edmund Carver, and was now, with considerable patience, waiting to see whether Carver was equal to the challenge. 13 days. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Compass Rose. Item 14 from the Chapman evidence catalog was a folded square of paper measuring approximately 3 inches by 3 inches when unfolded, recovered from inside the left-hand cuff of Annie Chapman's dress, where it had been tucked rather than carried loosely, an act of concealment, or at minimum, of preservation. It had been catalogued on the 9th of September by Constable Donovan, who had noted it as a scrap of notepaper, written upon, possibly belonging to the deceased, and had moved on to more apparently significant items. Aberline laid it on the desk before Carver at 20 minutes past 10, and both men leaned over it without speaking. The paper bore two things: the compass rose, which matched the symbol on the letter with the precision of a signature, and 5 words written in the same educated hand. She did not know. She did not know what? Aberline said. That's the question he wants us to ask, Carver said. He was already reaching for his notebook, opening it to the pages he had filled during the Chapman post-mortem and the subsequent scene examination. He placed this in her clothing, before or during. He paused, forcing himself to maintain clinical detachment, before or during the act itself, which means he had time. He was calm. He was deliberate. Or it was placed there afterward, and Chapman carried it unknowingly for some time prior. Carver looked up. That was a better observation than he had been about to make, and he said so. Which means, Aberline continued, that she may have received it from him willingly, as a note, a message, something ordinary. She tucked it into her cuff herself, perhaps not even reading it, or reading it and not understanding. She did not know. The words acquired a different dimension under that interpretation, not a statement the killer had made at the scene, but a statement he had planted in advance, knowing that when investigators eventually found it, they would recognize its terrible double meaning. She did not know the note she carried would outlive her. She did not know what the man who gave it to her intended. She did not know him. He knew her, Carver said, well enough to give her a note without alarming her, well enough that she carried it voluntarily, preserved it in her clothing. He set his pen down. These women were not random selections. He said as much in the letter. Each was selected according to a principle that your colleagues have entirely failed to perceive. Connection between the victims, Aberline said immediately. This was not a new theory. The suggestion that the murdered women might have known one another or shared a common acquaintance had circulated within the investigation for weeks. But it had been pursued without conviction, primarily because the obvious connections that they were all women in desperate poverty, living in common lodging houses, working the same streets were so broad as to be uninformative. Not merely between the victims, Carver said. Between the victims and him. He knew them. He knew Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. Knew them well enough to make contact without raising alarm. He looked at the 5 words on the paper. And whatever they did not know, whatever she did not know, is the principle of selection. By noon, the evidence materials had arrived from 4 separate stations, transported in wooden crates by constables, who moved with the carefully controlled urgency of men who have been told that their cargo is important, without being told precisely why. Carver and Aberline spread everything across the largest table in the station's back room, the room ordinarily used for shift briefings, smelling perpetually of tobacco and damp wool, and began the painstaking work of re-examining material that had already been examined. Dr. Phillips arrived at noon, uninvited but apparently unable to stay away. He was a small, precise man, with a meticulous gray beard and eyes that had seen too much of what the human body could suffer, and now looked at the world with a kind of careful sorrow. He read the letter and the note from the Chapman cuff without expression, then set both down and stood for a moment in the posture of a man conducting a private argument. I should tell you something, he said, that I included in my formal report, but did not emphasize during our briefings because I felt at the time that it was peripheral. Tell me now, Carver said. The injuries sustained by Annie Chapman showed evidence of anatomical knowledge. This has been discussed at length, and I won't rehearse it. But there was a specific aspect of the procedure that pointed toward not merely familiarity with anatomy in the general medical sense, but familiarity with a particular kind of surgical practice. A technique associated with abdominal surgery as conducted within the last decade, influenced by developments coming out of the German schools. Specific procedural conventions that would not be known to a general practitioner, but would be known to someone who had either trained in or studied the relevant literature from those institutions. The room was quiet except for the rain against the narrow window. You're describing a specialist, Aberline said. I'm describing someone with a very specific educational profile, Phillips said carefully. I did not say this publicly because I was concerned about the effect of such a statement on the investigation's direction. The press was already pursuing the mad doctor theory with considerable enthusiasm, and I felt that my feeding that speculation without concrete evidence would be professionally irresponsible. "Who else knew this?" Carver asked. "I told Commissioner Warren in private correspondence. Whether he acted upon it, I cannot say." Carver made a note. Then he turned back to the evidence table and picked up a small item he had been turning over in his mind since arriving, a button recovered from near the body of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, which had been logged as possibly belonging to a suspect's clothing, but had never been matched to any garment. It was an unusual button, dark horn rather than the more common bone or metal, with a subtle cross-hatched pattern on its face. He had seen that pattern before, in a different context, in a different city. He could not yet locate the memory precisely it sat at the edge of his recollection, identifiable by shape, but not yet by name. He set the button down and made another note, this one underlined. At 2 o'clock, a visitor arrived who had not been invited and whose presence immediately altered the temperature of the room. His name was Mr. Clarence Holt, and he arrived with a card identifying him as a special correspondent, the Evening Standard, which was the polite description for what he actually was. The journalist who had, more than any other individual, shaped the public narrative of the Whitechapel murders over the preceding weeks. Holt was 35, well-dressed in a way that spoke of income slightly beyond a journalist's normal reach, with a quick intelligence in his eyes and the practiced social ease of a man who had spent his career talking his way into rooms he was not supposed to enter. "I won't pretend I don't know about the letter," Holt said, before anyone had invited him to speak. "I know there was a letter on the body in Commercial Road. I know it was addressed to you, Inspector Carver. I know you've been pulling evidence materials from 4 stations this morning. And I know," he paused, with a particular timing of a man who has learned to deploy information strategically, "that the symbol on the letter matches something recovered from one of the original crime scenes." The silence in the room became considerably more charged. "How?" Carver said, with a quietness that was more alarming than volume. "Do you know about the symbol?" Holt smiled, which was the wrong response to Carver's tone but appeared to be involuntary. "I have sources within the investigation, Inspector, as you are no doubt aware. What I'm here to offer is an exchange of information, what I know for what you know, with a mutual agreement about publication timing." "What you're here to do," Aberline said from across the table, with considerably less restraint than Carver, "is inform us that our investigation has been compromised by someone with access to restricted evidence materials who is feeding information to the press." Holt's smile diminished slightly. "That is one interpretation." "Tell me your source," Carver said. "Absolutely not." "Then I'll ask you to leave and instruct the constable on the door to prevent your return." Carver turned back to the evidence table and then added, without looking around, "Unless you came to tell us something specific that you believe we need to know, in which case I will listen to it without making any commitments about what happens afterward." A long pause. Holt apparently weighed several options. "I received a letter," he said finally, 2 days ago, posted from Whitechapel, addressed to me personally at the Standard offices. The same handwriting is based on the letter you received, which I have not seen but whose characteristics I've had described to me the same handwriting. Mine also contained a compass rose." The room seemed to contract around those words. "Mine said something different," Holt continued. "It said, 'You have already been given the answer. You published it yourself on the 21st of September. Read what you wrote more carefully.'" Carver sent for the Evening Standard archive copies at once. A constable departed for Fleet Street at a near run. Holt sat in the corner of the room with a cup of tea he had not requested but had been given to keep him cooperative, watching the detective and the surgeon work through the evidence table with the careful attention of a man storing every observable detail for future publication. While they waited, Carver pulled his notebook to a fresh page and began writing in the precise, compressed hand he used for summary thinking. What is established? 1. He knows the investigation's internal workings, source within police or medical examination process. 2. He has contacted both the primary detective, myself, and the primary press correspondent, Holt, with related but distinct messages. 3. Item placed in Chapman's clothing prior to discovery, possibly prior to death, pre-planned. 4. Specialist surgical knowledge. German school methods narrows the educational profile significantly. 5. The compass rose is a signature, not a random symbol. Used at minimum twice. Chapman's cuff, the letter. What he claims, 1. A principle of selection connecting all victims. 2. A clue already in our possession. 3. That I am closest to the truth while being furthest from it. What he has not claimed. 1. Credit for any specific murder by name. 2. Any ransom or demand beyond the 14-day ultimatum. 3. Any reason for writing at all. That last point was the most interesting. Why write? The obvious answer's vanity, a desire for recognition, a compulsion to communicate, did not fully satisfy Carver's assessment of the letter's tone. The writing was too controlled for pure narcissism. The choice of recipient was too deliberate for simple attention-seeking. The killer had written to Carver specifically, and to Holt specifically, with messages crafted for each recipient. He was directing the investigation. He wanted it to go somewhere specific, to find something specific, and he was guiding it there like a shepherd guiding a flock he controlled entirely. The question was, where was he leading them, and why? The standard archive arrived at 3:30, carried by a breathless constable in a damp overcoat. The 30th of September's front page was almost entirely consumed by the double event, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night, which had transfixed London. But Holt's letter had specified the 21st of September. Carver found the relevant edition and spread it on the table. The 21st of September, 1888. He scanned the front page, then the inside pages. Court reports, a parliamentary debate on housing conditions in the East End. A letter to the editor decrying foreign immigration, and, on page 4, a lengthy piece under Holt's byline headlined, "The Whitechapel Murders, What the Police Are Not Telling You." Carver read it with careful attention. It was good journalism, thorough, precisely sourced, written with a control of narrative that he could recognize as craft even while resenting its implications for his investigation. Holt had interviewed 12 witnesses and compiled a detailed picture of the movements of the canonical victims in the hours before their deaths. He had obtained information from 2 medical sources about the nature of the injuries. He had reconstructed, with startling accuracy, the geographical pattern of the crimes. And there, in the 15th paragraph, was a detail that Carver had not known Holt possessed. A description, brief and apparently incidental, of a small gathering at a Whitechapel lodging house on Flower and Dean Street, where several women who would later become victims had been observed in conversation with an unknown man, described by a neighboring lodger only as well-dressed and foreign-speaking, with an unusual accent that the witness could not precisely place. Same man. All 4 victims. 1 location. She did not know. Carver looked up from the newspaper and found that Phillips was already looking at him with the expression of a man who has arrived at the same destination by a different route. They all lodged at different houses, Phillips said quietly. But they all used Flower and Dean Street. For the baths. For the soup kitchen. The street was common ground. He knew them there, Carver said. He found them there. And he gave Annie Chapman a note there, perhaps weeks before she died, and she tucked it into her cuff and forgot about it, or kept it for a reason we'll never know. He looked down at the 5 words again. She did not know. She didn't know when she accepted a note from a well-dressed foreign gentleman on Flower and Dean Street that the man had already determined she would die. The afternoon light was failing. Outside, the gas lamps of Whitechapel were beginning their nightly effort against the dark, producing their characteristic amber blur in the thickening fog. Somewhere out in those streets, in one of the lodging houses or pubs or narrow courts that made up the geography of the East End, a man was waiting to see whether Edmund Carver had found his clue. 13 days had become 12, and Carver had just realized that the man they were hunting was not hiding in Whitechapel's shadows. He was walking its streets in daylight. Known, perhaps respected, certainly trusted. A man whose presence on Flower and Dean Street had been so unremarkable to the women who died there that not a single witness had thought to mention him until a journalist, by accident, had teased the detail loose. He set the newspaper down. He picked up the horn button from the evidence table. The cross-hatched pattern, the dark horn, the specific manufacturing technique. The memory arrived, finally, from wherever it had been hiding. He had seen buttons exactly like this one 6 years earlier, on the coat of a man he had interviewed in connection with an entirely separate case, a man who had been a student, at the time, at the University of. The station door opened. A constable entered, pale and slightly breathless. "Inspector Carver, there's a woman outside. She says she knows who gave Annie Chapman the note. She says she was there, on Flower and Dean Street. She was there, and she saw his face. And the constable swallowed. And she says she's been afraid to come forward for 3 weeks because the man she saw told her, specifically, that if she spoke to the police, she would be next. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The Witness. Her name was Clara Dowd, and she was 32 years old, which looked like 45 in the gaslit anteroom of Le Mans Street Station. She wore a black wool dress that had been good quality once, a decade ago, and a shawl that she held closed at her throat with both hands, despite the relative warmth of the room. Her eyes moved constantly to the window, to the door, to the faces of the 2 men sitting across the small table from her, with the darting attention of a creature that has spent recent weeks expecting danger from every direction. She was not, Carver noted, performing fear. She was genuinely terrified, and had been for some time. There was a quality to genuine prolonged fear that he had learned to recognize, a kind of physical diminishment, as though the body was spending its resources on vigilance rather than ordinary maintenance. Clara Dowd had that quality. He gave her tea. He sent Abeline to stand in the corridor, because the room felt less threatening with only one investigator present. He waited. "You don't know what it's been like," she said finally. 3 weeks, not sleeping, not going out after dark, telling Mrs. Henniker I was ill, so I didn't lose my position at the laundry. "You're safe here," Carver said, and kept his voice neutral enough that it did not sound like a promise he could not keep. "He knew my name," Clara said. "That's the thing. That's what frightened me most, more than what he said. He knew my name, and I'd never spoken to him. And when he said it Clara, he said, just Clara, like he was greeting an acquaintance. I felt the world go sideways." She had been standing near the soup kitchen on Flower and Dean Street on the afternoon of the 24th of August, 5 days before the first canonical murder. She went there twice a week for herself and for her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Potts, who could no longer manage the walk. She knew the women who worked the street by sight, as neighbors are known in the East End, without formal acquaintance but with the familiarity of shared geography. She had seen Annie Chapman speaking with a man near the kitchen entrance. "Describe him," Carver said. Clara closed both hands around her teacup. Tall, not unusual tall, but above ordinary. He had quality. That's the word I keep returning to. Quality of dress, of movement. His coat was dark wool, very fine. His hat was correct. He wasn't a working man, wasn't a gentleman out slumming, which you see occasionally. He was, she paused, he was a man who belonged in a better street but was completely comfortable in a worse one, as if he knew Flower and Dean Street. His face, Carver said, angular, clean-shaven, which I noticed because most men of his obvious station keep a beard or mustache. Aged, perhaps 40, perhaps somewhat older, it was difficult to say. His eyes, she stopped again. His eyes were what I remember most clearly, very pale, light brown or hazel, but pale in the way that eyes sometimes are when there's strong feeling behind them. Controlled strong feeling. Controlled strong feeling. Carver wrote the phrase in his notebook without comment. He was speaking to Annie Chapman quietly. She was nodding, as you nod when something is perfectly ordinary. She didn't appear frightened or uncertain. He gave her something. Clara touched her own cuff, an involuntary gesture, a small piece of paper, folded. She put it in her sleeve. Then he looked up, across the street, and he saw me looking. "What did he do?" "He smiled," Clara said. "And then he walked across the street, and he stood beside me, and he said, 'Clara,' and I cannot explain why, but I wanted desperately to run. He said, 'You haven't seen me here. When the police come asking, and they will come asking eventually, you have not seen me here.' And I thought perhaps I was wrong about him. Perhaps I was imagining danger, until he said, 'I know where Mrs. Potts lives, 3rd floor, number 4. She keeps a candle burning all night because she's afraid of the dark.'" Clara's voice remained steady, but only barely. He said, "The candle is a fire risk. Help me help her, Clara. Don't speak to anyone." He had threatened an elderly woman with a candle, not with violence explicitly stated, but with the specific detail that demonstrated intimate knowledge of her life. He had warned Clara Dowd not with a weapon, but with information, and it had been entirely sufficient. "Why are you speaking to us now?" Carver asked. "Because I read this morning's papers," Clara said. "Because another man is dead, and there was a letter. And I thought, if he's writing letters, then perhaps he wants to be found. And if he wants to be found, then perhaps there's nothing left to protect by staying quiet. It was not a fully rational calculation, Carver recognized. It was the reasoning of a frightened woman who had found a sufficiently large justification to do what she had wanted to do for 3 weeks. But it had brought her here, and that was what mattered. His accent? Carver said. Did you notice it? Something shifted in Clara's expression. I did. I've been trying to place it since. It was English, educated English, but underneath it, something else. Continental. Not French. Not the accents you sometimes hear from the Jewish immigrants in the area. Something from further north or east. I've heard a similar accent, once, from a German medical student I encountered briefly when I worked at the London hospital some years ago. But whether it was the same, she shook her head. German. Continental. Medical knowledge of German school methods. A well-dressed man comfortable on Flower and Dean Street. 3 lines of evidence converging on the same profile. Carver folded his notebook. I need to ask you something difficult, he said. The man on Flower and Dean Street, is there any possibility that Annie Chapman knew him well? Not as an acquaintance, but as someone she had a regular connection to? Clara thought for a long moment. The way she received the note, the way she put it away, it was the way you receive something from a familiar person. Something expected. Not a surprise. She looked at Carver directly for the first time. I think she'd received notes from him before. After Clara Dowd had been escorted to a temporary lodging arranged by the station, with 2 constables posted who would remain there until Carver decided what further steps were necessary, he returned to the evidence room and stood in front of the table for a long time without moving. The horn button was in his coat pocket. He had not shown it to anyone yet. He pulled it out and laid it on the table, then set beside it the letter and the Chapman note, and the copy of Holt's article from the 21st, and the case notes from the German methods observation by Phillips, and the 6 words, she did not know, and you haven't seen me here, and Clara, said like a greeting to a stranger. A man who knew his victims before he killed them, who gave them notes and perhaps small gifts and ordinary conversation, who had a medical education with specific continental influences, who was comfortable in the East End despite not belonging to it, who knew not only the investigation's evidence but its personnel, who was, in some capacity, close enough to the investigation to know that Carver was the right person to address. Clarence Holt was still in the corridor, having refused to leave and having not been officially expelled. Carver found him there at 5 o'clock and made a decision he suspected he would later question. I'm going to show you something, Carver said, and you are not going to publish it for a minimum of 2 weeks. That is the price of continued access to this investigation. If you agree to those terms, you will be the most comprehensively informed journalist in London when this concludes. If you don't, I will have you removed and discredited. Holt looked at him for a moment. What am I not going to publish? Carver held up the horn button. Holt leaned forward. Something moved in his expression, not the excitement of a journalist finding a story, but something older and more complicated. Recognition, perhaps. Where did you find that? Holt said quietly. Mitre Square. The Eddowes scene. Carver watched him carefully. You've seen this before. It was not a question. Holt's expression had answered it. There is a man, Holt said slowly, whom I interviewed 3 weeks ago in connection with a different story entirely. A story about the influx of European medical professionals to London hospitals over the past decade. A man at the London hospital. He wore a coat with buttons exactly like that one. Carver's left hand, in his coat pocket, had stopped trembling. His name, Carver said. Holt opened his mouth. The station door at the end of the corridor burst open. A constable came through it at speed, nearly colliding with a filing cabinet, his face white. Inspector Carver, he said, breathless. There's been another letter, posted this morning from the General Post Office in the city, addressed to the Times, not to us. They've just received it. He held out a folded paper. It was delivered to us because it mentions you by name. It says he swallowed. It says that Inspector Carver is lying, that the police have already found the killer and released him, and it names the man. It says his name is End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Accused. The name in the letter to the Times was Dr. Heinrich Strauss. Within 6 hours of that letter's publication for the Times did publish it, despite Scotland Yard's urgent request to withhold it. Operating on the principle that the public interest in the Whitechapel murders superseded any investigative convenience, the name Heinrich Strauss was on every newspaper front page in London. By the following morning, it had become a roar. "Ripper named," declared the Star. "Scotland Yard knew and said nothing," the Daily Telegraph insinuated. The Evening Standard, Holt's own paper, ran the most measured piece, a carefully worded article, noting that the letter was unverified and its author unknown, that the individual named deserved the presumption of innocence, that the Metropolitan Police had neither confirmed nor denied the claim. Holt's byline was on that piece, and Carver suspected the measured tone reflected the particular frustration of a journalist who knows more than he can yet say. Dr. Heinrich Strauss was 44 years old, a surgeon of Austrian birth and German medical training who had been resident in London for 11 years. He held a senior position at the London Hospital on Whitechapel Road. Carver could have walked there in 12 minutes from Lemon Street Station. He was a specialist in abdominal surgery who had, according to the hospital's records, which Carver obtained by 9 o'clock the following morning, performed more than 200 operations in the preceding 3 years. He was known in medical circles for his technical excellence and his commitment to the German School of Antiseptic Surgical Practice, which he had learned under a distinguished professor in Vienna before moving to London. He lived, with his wife and 2 daughters, on a respectable street in Stepney, 20 minutes walk from Whitechapel. He had been questioned briefly in the broad sweep of door-to-door inquiries following the Chapman murder, questioned and released within 40 minutes, because he had an alibi for the night in question, had been cooperative, and had been assessed by the constable conducting the interview as an unlikely suspect. The alibi was a dinner at the home of a colleague, 7 witnesses. Carver drove to the London hospital at 9:30 and found the building already surrounded by a small but vocal crowd, apparently spontaneously assembled, demanding without entirely clear purpose that justice be done. A group of men at the front were chanting something rhythmic and unintelligible. 3 constables had taken up positions at the entrance without orders, operating on reasonable initiative. Inside, the hospital's administrative secretary met Carver in the entrance hall with the expression of a man who has experienced the worst morning of his professional career and anticipates the afternoon making it worse. "Dr. Strauss has not come in today," the secretary said. "He was expected at 8 for a surgical consultation. He did not arrive. We have sent word to his home. And his wife says he left the house at his usual time." Carver digested this. "She's not alarmed?" "She is now," the secretary said. The disappearance of Dr. Heinrich Strauss, for that, was what it became, by noon, when he had failed to appear at the hospital, at his home, or at any of the 3 social clubs he was known to frequent, ignited a public response that had been building since August and now had a specific object toward which to direct itself. By afternoon, the name Strauss was graffitied on several walls in Whitechapel. By evening, a group of men, organized by whom was unclear, had gone to his house in Stepney, where his wife and daughters had retreated behind locked doors. Commissioner Warren issued a statement urging public restraint. The Times published an editorial noting, somewhat belatedly, that the letter accusing Strauss was anonymous and unverified. None of this made any difference. The crowd had a name, and a name was what it had been missing for 8 weeks. George Lusk and the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee organized themselves rather more productively. Lusk came to Leman Street Station at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and spoke to Carver with the direct, practical manner of a builder who has learned to frame problems architecturally. "I don't believe he's guilty," Lusk said, "which is going to put me at odds with most of my committee, but there it is." "Why not?" Carver said. "Because the letter naming him is too convenient. Because a man who has been conducting these murders with the precision and calm that your investigation has described would not lose his composure simply because a journalist is writing a story about him. He would do something about it, perhaps exactly what has been done. Generate a diversion, a named suspect, an accused man whose arrest satisfies the public while the actual killer remains at liberty." "You've been following the investigation very closely," Carver said. "I've been reading every newspaper report and speaking to every witness who will speak to me," Lusk said, without apology, "which is what my committee was formed to do." "We are not amateurs interfering with your work, Inspector. We are citizens attempting to protect our community in the absence of adequate protection from the official authorities." It was a criticism delivered without aggression, and Carver accepted it without argument because it was substantially accurate. "What do you know about Flower and Dean Street?" Carver asked. Lusk's eyes sharpened. As a location in the investigation? As a location generally. It's common ground. Women from a dozen different lodging houses use it. The soup kitchen, the baths, the market. If you wanted to make regular contact with a rotating population of vulnerable women without any single encounter being memorable, Flower and Dean Street in the afternoon hours would be an ideal location. He paused. Is that where he found them? I'm not confirming that publicly. I'm not the public, Inspector. I'm the chairman of the committee that is currently the only civilian organization helping to maintain public order in this part of London. Carver looked at him for a moment. Is there anyone on Flower and Dean Street who keeps records? A market stall? A kitchen register? Anyone who might have noted unfamiliar visitors over the summer? The soup kitchen keeps a register, Lusk said immediately. They started doing so in July, after a donation was misappropriated. They note everyone who receives assistance, not visitors. But if your man was presenting himself as a benefactor rather than a user of services, he might have been noted. It was the most useful thing anyone had said to Carver in 3 days. The soup kitchen on Flower and Dean Street was operated by a woman named Mrs. Frances Haig, who had been feeding the East End's poor for 11 years with the combination of practical efficiency and contained sorrow that such work produces in people who genuinely care about it. She was 60, solid, not easily impressed by official visits. She found the relevant register entry on the second attempt. There was a gentleman, she said, turning the pages with care, who came to us in July, late July, I believe representing himself as a representative of a private charitable foundation interested in supplementing our work. He sat with several of the women, asked questions. He said he was conducting an inquiry into conditions on behalf of his foundation. She found the page, July the 23rd. In a neat column, labeled Visitors and Benefactors, a single entry. Dr. F. Morrow, Rep. of the Meyer Foundation, inquiring into dietary provisions. Is the Meyer Foundation known to you? Carver asked. I looked it up after his visit. I couldn't find any record of it. She folded her hands. I assumed there had been a miscommunication somewhere. It happens. Organizations change their names. I wasn't alarmed, and the man had behaved entirely properly. Did he give you a card? She opened a drawer and produced, with the organized efficiency of someone who files everything, a visiting card. Dr. F. Morrow, the Meyer Foundation, 14 Harley Street, W. The card was the same cream notepaper as the letter to Carver, the same printing style. The address, he had no doubt, would prove to be false. But the handwriting on the soup kitchen register entry, Dr. F. Morrow, Rep. of the Meyer Foundation, was written in the same educated, controlled hand as the letter, the Chapman note, the Times accusation. He had signed himself there, casually, never expecting anyone to connect it. And this possibility made Carver's pen pause over his notebook he had signed himself, knowing, eventually, that someone would. F. Morrow, not Strauss, not his own name, a false name beginning with F. He had sent a letter signed only J. He had drawn compass roses at 2 separate crime-adjacent locations. He had, apparently, given the women he intended to kill small pieces of paper with cryptic messages. He was leaving a trail, not accidentally. The trail was deliberate, architected, designed to lead somewhere specific. Carver thought about the letter again. You remain the furthest from the truth. Not you will never find the truth. Not you are incapable of finding it. The furthest from it implying a distance that could be traveled, a direction that could be followed. He was being guided. The question was not whether to follow the trail. That was already decided. The 13-day countdown ensured it. The question was whether the destination at the trail's end was the truth, or something else entirely. Dr. Strauss was found at 6:30 that evening, in his office at the London hospital, where he had been sitting since morning with the door locked. He had, apparently, read the morning papers, gone directly to his office rather than to the surgical ward, and spent the day in a state of controlled paralysis while London debated his guilt. Carver interviewed him there, with Aberline present, while the crowd outside had thinned, but not entirely dispersed. Strauss was a lean, angular man with precise movements and the focused attention of a surgeon accustomed to conditions where distraction kills. He was frightened genuinely, deeply frightened, but the fear was shaped differently than Clara Dowd's. Hers had been the fear of a vulnerable woman threatened directly. His was the fear of a man watching something systematic close around him. You received a letter, Carver said. It was not a question. Strauss looked at him sharply. How do you know that? Because everything that has happened today was arranged, Carver said. The letter to the Times was arranged. Your disappearance from your normal routine, which made you look guilty, was arranged by someone who knew that receiving a letter this morning would cause you to do exactly what you did. He leaned forward. Slightly. What did the letter say? Strauss opened the breast pocket of his coat and produced an envelope. The cream notepaper. The educated hand. Inside, a single line. Come forward, doctor, or I will arrange for you to be found. And a compass rose. He's threatening you, Aberline said. He's threatening me, Strauss agreed. And whoever he is, he knows something about me that... He stopped. Something that, Carver prompted, with the patience of a man who has learned that the pauses before witnesses finish their sentences often contain the most important information. You would prefer not to become public. Strauss was quiet for a long time. Outside, a church bell counted the half hour. I knew Annie Chapman, he said finally. Not well, but I knew her. She had been a patient, briefly, at this hospital 3 years ago. A minor operation. She recovered fully. I had not seen her since. He looked at his hands. If it became known that I had treated one of the victims, regardless of the circumstances or the length of time, the inference the newspapers would draw would be devastating, Carver said. Yes. Then someone who knew both your connection to Annie Chapman and your vulnerability to that inference arranged for you to become the public suspect, knowing that your first instinct would be to hide rather than come forward. Carver sat back. Which means whoever is sending these letters knows the victim records, the hospital records, the medical knowledge, the hospital access, the records. How many surgeons at this hospital would have had access to the records of Annie Chapman's treatment 3 years ago? Carver asked. Strauss thought. A senior surgeon would have access to any patient record. A junior physician would have access to records within their ward. Administrative staff. The record keepers themselves. He paused. It is not a small number, but you would know them. You work here daily. If I gave you a description, tall, angular, continental accent, light-colored eyes, approximately 40 years old, specific familiarity with the German antiseptic surgical methods. Dr. Morrow, Strauss said immediately. The name landed in the room like something thrown. He worked here, Strauss said slowly, 2 years ago, for 8 months. An exchange arrangement, he said, with a teaching hospital in Leipzig. He left abruptly, some professional disagreement, I was told, though I never knew the details. I barely knew him myself. He was very quiet, very contained. I remember his eyes very pale, very attentive. He looked at Carver. I remember thinking that his name seemed wrong for him somehow. Morrow is an English name, and he was not English. He used the same name with the soup kitchen, Carver said. Dr. F. Morrow. Then he's been in Whitechapel all along, Aberline said, under an assumed identity while the whole of London searches for him. Not the whole of London, Carver said. He was standing up, reaching for his coat. The whole of London is searching for Heinrich Strauss. He looked at Strauss. You're going to need protection tonight. I'll arrange it. What will you do? Strauss asked. The soup kitchen register gave me a name, Carver said, and the name gave me an origin. And the origin, he picked up his hat, tells me where to look for something that doesn't yet exist in any evidence box. The door of Strauss's office, as he opened it, admitted a wave of hospital smell, carbolic, illness, the particular clean sourness of surgical environments, and beneath it, barely detectable, something that made Carver stop for one moment in the doorway. Tobacco. A specific tobacco, rich and slightly sweet, with a continental character he recognized from the evidence notes, a scent recorded at the Mitre Square scene by a constable and dismissed as belonging to a passerby. The tobacco smell was coming from somewhere in the corridor. Someone had been standing outside that door. When Carver stepped into the corridor, both directions were empty. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Principal. The night rain came down on Whitechapel with the particular density of October storms, filling the gutters and streaming off the market awnings and turning the cobblestones into a dark mirror that reflected the gas lamps in broken, shimmering fragments. Carver walked from the London hospital to Lemon Street Station in 11 minutes, coat collar up, and thought for the entire 11 minutes about tobacco. The scent at Mitre Square had been noted at approximately 2 in the morning in a constable's supplementary report filed a week after the event. The constable, Thomas Quill, had included it almost as an afterthought, noting that the smell seemed wrong for the location too refined for the typical pipe tobacco of Mitre Square's nightly inhabitants, not matching any known tobacco vendor in the immediate area. It had been classified as possibly belonging to a member of the public who had passed through before the body was discovered and had not been pursued. The same tobacco in Strauss's hospital corridor 2 hours ago. He had been outside that door, which meant he knew about the interview with Strauss, which meant he had either followed Carver to the hospital or known in advance that the interview would take place there, which required either the ability to shadow a Scotland Yard detective without detection, not impossible for someone sufficiently experienced, or access to information about Carver's intentions that had not been shared. Outside a small group, he was close. Not metaphorically, not in the loose sense of existing within the same city. He was physically close, moving through the same spaces, hearing the same conversations, breathing the same air. Carver's left hand had stopped trembling entirely. He recognized this as a symptom of a specific mental state, the state in which the investigation has narrowed to a single thread and all other concerns have been subordinated to following it. It was a useful state for the final stages of a case and a dangerous one for everything else. He had been in it twice before in his career, and on both occasions it had delivered results and extracted a cost that took months to pay. He was in it now. The key question, the one the letter had posed and Carver had been circling for 3 days, was the principle of selection. Why these 4 women? Not why women in general, which was a psychological and sociological question with various unsatisfying answers, but why these specific women? What connected Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes in a way that this particular man, with his surgical knowledge and continental education, and studied familiarity with Whitechapel, had identified and acted upon? The obvious connections were insufficient. They were all women living in poverty in the East End. They were all, at various times, engaged in prostitution to pay for lodgings. They were all known to frequent the same streets, the same kitchen, the same public houses. These connections were shared by dozens, perhaps hundreds, of women in Whitechapel. They could not be the principle of selection, because if they were, the principle predicted far more victims than had occurred. Something specific to these 4. Something the killer knew that a neighbor or a casual acquaintance would not know. Carver had been asking this question for 3 days, and the answer arrived at 10:30 that night, when he was sitting in the evidence room with a cold cup of tea and Phillips's post-mortem reports arranged in chronological order before him. It was in the reports, and he had read them 6 times without seeing it, because it required reading them not as separate documents, but as a sequence looking not for what each report said, but for what each report, minus the previous, had added. Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. The injuries, the specific nature of the injuries, the progression. Phillips had noted it in his typically understated way, in the 4th report, in a subordinate clause that might easily be read as a general comment. The incisions display a progressive refinement of method consistent with either growing familiarity or deliberate practice. Deliberate practice. Carver sat very still. He thought about surgical training. The way a student surgeon develops technique through repetition, through a systematic progression from less complex to more complex procedures, through the careful accumulation of specific skills in a specific sequence. He thought about the German school methods Phillips had mentioned, structured, systematic, building each operation on the foundations of the last. He thought about the word corrective, which the killer had used in his letter. I am a corrective mechanism. I am a physician treating a disease. He thought about what disease would require, in a medical mind distorted beyond all reasonable functioning, a surgical solution. And what connection between 4 specific women would make them, in such a mind, symptomatic? He needed the hospital records. Not Strauss's records, which he had already examined. The records of the exchange arrangement, the 8 months' work of the man who called himself Dr. F. Morrow, at the London hospital. The London hospital's administrative office was locked at that hour, but the night superintendent opened it without excessive argument when Carver produced his warrant card and his most authoritative expression. The records were held in leather-bound ledgers organized by year, and Carver found the relevant volume 1886 to 1887 in 20 minutes. Dr. Francis Morrow's appointment record was sparse. He had arrived in January 1887, assigned to the surgical wards under a senior consultant named Mr. Aldous. He had treated 43 patients during his 8 months. He had left in August 1887 following what the record described only as a formal disagreement with hospital policy regarding patient management. Carver pulled the individual patient files. He was looking for something he was not yet certain, what that would appear in those 43 cases but not in the general hospital population. He found it in the 12th file. He verified it in the 17th. By the 28th file, he was sitting very still and his left hand had not moved in 20 minutes. 12 of Dr. Morrow's 43 patients at the London hospital had shared a specific characteristic. They were all women from the East End who had undergone a particular procedure, a relatively new procedure, one of the German methods, related to a condition associated with a specific kind of poverty-driven illness. All 12 had received treatment in the hospital's charity ward. Of those 12, Carver could account for 8 through subsequent records. 2 had died of unrelated causes. 4 had moved away from the East End entirely. The remaining 2 names he did not yet recognize. But 4 of the original 12 were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes. He had treated them. 2 years before their deaths, he had been their surgeon. He had cared for them in the charity ward of the London hospital, treated a specific condition, and then at some point between 1887 and 1888, a decision had been made, in a mind that had passed some threshold of distorted reckoning, that the disease he had attempted to treat required a different remedy. The corrective mechanism, the physician treating a disease. He had not stopped being their doctor. He had simply changed his conception of the treatment. Carver thought about the note in Annie Chapman's cuff. She did not know. She had not known, accepting that small folded paper from the hand of a man she may even have remembered with some gratitude as someone who had cared for her illness, that his care had taken a direction she would not have recognized as care at all. The remaining 2 women from the 12, the ones Carver could not immediately account for. He needed their names and their current locations before dawn. He was already writing a note for the night superintendent when a different thought stopped him. The killer had written, "There is a clue you have already seen, already touched, already filed in your evidence boxes." Item 14. The Chapman note. The compass rose. But also, I will give you 1 fortnight to find it. 13 days from the letter's arrival. 12 now. Why 13 days, specifically? Why not 10? Why not 20? Carver counted backward from the 14th of October, the date the killer had named. He counted back exactly 13 days. The 30th of September. The 30th of September was the date the letter had arrived. It was also the date of the double event, Stride and Eddowes, killed in the same night. 2 women in a single night, breaking the pattern that had previously suggested 1 victim at a time. The double event had been chaotic, compressed, the work of a man who had been interrupted during the first killing and had felt compelled or unable not to complete what he had begun. Every investigator in the case had read the double event as evidence of escalation, of a man losing control of his timeline. What if it was not escalation but conclusion? What if the double event had completed some internal sequence? What if the 14-day clock he had given Carver was not a threat but a promise, a genuine statement that there would be no more, unless the clue was not found? 8 patients treated, 4 murdered, the remaining 4 currently unaccounted for, unwarned, unprotected. Or was that what he wanted Carver to think? He was reading the 12th patient file when he noticed the handwriting on the admission form. It was not the educated, controlled hand of the letters. It was a clerk's hand, a hospital clerk's ordinary, efficient scrawl. But the notation in the margin, a small annotation about a follow-up appointment, the kind of informal note a treating physician makes for his own reference, was in a hand he recognized. And beside the follow-up notation, drawn in the margin of a charity patient's medical file from 1887, was a compass rose the size of a fingernail. He had been marking them for over a year. These women, these patients of his. He had been marking them, and returning to them, and giving them notes on Flower and Dean Street before the first murder, preparing himself for something, working towards something, and whatever that something was, it had been planned with the cold deliberateness of a medical procedure. The 2 remaining patients from the 12, the 2 unaccounted for. Carver had their names now. He had 11 days. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. The second message. The name of the first unaccounted patient was Margaret Farrow, 38. Last known address a lodging house on Thrall Street. Occupation listed in the hospital record as charwoman. The name of the second was Ellen Pye, 41. Last known address a single room above a tobacconist shop on Dorset Street. Occupation listed simply as casual. Carver had both names by midnight and both addresses in his notebook by 1 in the morning, after a constable spent 40 minutes working through the lodging house registers. Margaret Farrow was located first. She was in her room at Thrall Street, asleep, entirely unaware that her name was in a list that had already killed 4 people. She was woken with considerable care by a female constable, which Carver had specifically arranged, and told in language calibrated to inform, without terrorizing, that she should go nowhere alone and should speak to no one she did not know, and that a constable would be posted outside. She took this information with the particular stoicism of a woman who has received worse news in ordinary ways, and went back to sleep. Ellen Pye was not at the room on Dorset Street. The tobacconist below, roused from bed and not pleased about it, said that the woman upstairs had not been home since the previous evening. She went out most evenings, he said, with the tightly managed non-judgment of a man who had long ago concluded that other people's business was their own. Carver put 3 constables on Dorset Street and another pair working the adjacent streets, and spent the remaining pre-dawn hours in the evidence room, drinking tea that was too strong and writing in his notebook. The picture was almost complete, and its completeness terrified him for a reason that had nothing to do with the horror of the murders themselves. It terrified him because of its internal logic. Within its own premises, which were the premises of a severely damaged mind, a mind that had passed from the practice of medicine into something that wore medicine as a costume, the selection process was rational. A doctor who had treated 12 women and concluded, at some point after completing that treatment, that he had addressed the symptom while leaving the disease intact, a disease he could not forgive, a correction he had resolved to make. What disease? What had these women, these 12 specific women from the Whitechapel charity wards, done or been or represented that had triggered this resolution? The answer was in the hospital records, and it was simultaneously mundane and devastating. All 12 had been treated for the same condition. All 12 had, in the hospital's notation, been admitted following complications from the same procedure, a procedure performed not at the London hospital but elsewhere, in the casual and dangerous manner of a city that offered its poorest women no legitimate alternative. The hospital had repaired the damage. Dr. Morrow, whatever his real name was, had treated their wounds, restored their health, and then, months later, had decided that the repair was insufficient, that the restoration of their lives to their previous conditions was not a cure but a perpetuation. Carver stared at the wall for a long time. He was not a man who made his cases personal. He had maintained that principle through 15 years and dozens of investigations into violence at every scale. He maintained it now, but it required more effort than he was accustomed to needing. These women had been patients. They had come to a hospital for care, had received care, had trusted the man who provided it. The betrayal, embedded in what had followed, was of a quality that went beyond ordinary criminal motivation into something for which the criminal law, in Carver's experience, had no fully adequate language. Aberline arrived at 6 in the morning looking as though he had not slept, which was accurate. Carver briefed him in 20 minutes. Aberline listened without interruption, which was unusual for Aberline and indicated the degree to which the briefing was reordering his understanding of the case. "You're certain it's not Strauss," Aberline said, when Carver finished. "Strauss has been framed. The letter to the Times was designed to create a public suspect who would absorb attention while the real investigation stalled. Then Morrow, whatever his name actually is, knows that we now have his profile." "Yes." "Which means he knows that the letters have achieved their purpose and failed simultaneously. He guided us to the truth, but he also knows we're close enough to act." Aberline paused. Why would he do that? Guide us to the truth and then warn us by getting close to Strauss's office? He's contradicting himself. "He's not," Carver said. "The letters, the guidance, the countdown, this isn't vanity. It's not a game. He wants to be found. He's arranged everything to make it possible for us to find him. And the question that's been in my head since I first read the letter is, why? Why does he want to be found? Confession? Guilt? No. There's no guilt in those letters. There's calculation. He's calculated that being found serves some purpose." Carver picked up his pen. I think he believes that being found and the resulting investigation and the resulting exposure of the specific condition that connected all 12 women exposure in the newspapers, in the public discourse, will accomplish something that the murders themselves have begun. Aberline stared at him. He's trying to make a public argument. Through us. Through the investigation. He's using the investigation as a mechanism for publishing something that, in any other form, would simply be a pamphlet that nobody read. Carver exhaled slowly. The murders are the evidence. We are the means of distribution. That's the most disturbing thing anyone has said to me in 20 years of police work. Yes, Carver said. A second letter arrived at Scotland Yard at 8 o'clock that morning, addressed this time not to Carver but to Commissioner Warren directly. The commissioner had it in Carver's hands within the hour, having read it himself and arrived at Lemon Street Station personally, which suggested the letter's contents had moved even a man of Warren's institutional stoicism. The letter read, "Dear Commissioner Warren, I have been directing Inspector Carver toward a truth that reflects poorly on several institutions you are accustomed to protecting. I wish to inform you that the investigation is progressing satisfactorily, and that Carver, if left to his own devices without interference, will arrive at the complete truth within his allotted time. I would advise you to allow this to happen. If the investigation is interfered with, if Carver is reassigned, if evidence is suppressed, if the convenient fiction of Dr. Strauss's guilt is elevated over the inconvenient reality of my own, I will take the remaining 2 women immediately, without waiting for your 14 days. The remaining 2 women are already known to you, I believe. Please protect them well. Your servant in truth, J." Warren set a copy of the letter on the table with the care of a man placing a piece of evidence he wishes he did not possess. He was a military man by background, tall and rather rigid in bearing, and he received uncomfortable information by becoming slightly more erect, as though posture could serve as a defense against unwelcome facts. "He's protecting his own investigation," Warren said. "He's using us to protect the 2 remaining women." "He needs us to protect them," Carver said. "Because if they die, if we fail to protect them, the truth he's been engineering this entire operation to reveal dies with them." The public argument collapses without living witnesses to what connects the victims. He looked at Warren steadily. He never intended to kill all 12. He intended to kill a sufficient number to make his point, and then stop and be found, and have the investigation reveal the rest. That presumes a degree of self-control that seems inconsistent with everything about this case is inconsistent with the public conception of this killer, Carver said. The public conception was partly created by this killer, with considerable deliberateness. Warren absorbed this in silence. "You said the convenient fiction of Strauss's guilt," Warren said carefully. "Does Strauss have a role in this beyond being framed?" "I don't yet know," Carver said honestly. "There may be a connection between Morrow and Strauss that I haven't uncovered. Strauss knew him professionally. The disagreement that caused Morrow to leave the London hospital, I don't know yet what it was about." "Find out," Warren said. "And Carver," he paused with the particular hesitancy of a senior official about to say something that costs him something. "You have the full resources of this department. Everything." The disagreement between Morrow and the London hospital had been about a patient. Carver learned this from Mr. Aldous, the senior consultant under whom Morrow had worked, summoned to Leman Street Station at noon and interviewed with a thoroughness that made Aldous visibly uncomfortable. In June 1887, one of Morrow's patients, a woman admitted to the charity ward, had died following complications from her treatment. The death had been reviewed by the hospital board. Their conclusion had been that the patient's prior condition, not the treatment, was responsible for the outcome. Morrow had disputed this conclusion, apparently with considerable force, arguing that the patient's prior condition was itself the result of institutional neglect, that the system that had produced her condition, and the hospital's role in processing its consequences without addressing its causes, made the hospital morally responsible for her death. He used the word morally, Aldous said, with the expression of a man recalling an uncomfortable meeting in a clinical review. He said the hospital was morally complicit in the conditions that had killed her. The board found this language inappropriate and his analysis medically unsupportable, and he left. He was asked to leave. Yes, Aldous paused. He was an excellent surgeon, technically excellent. The board's decision was not based on his surgical competence, but on concerns about his judgment. His perspective had become, in the board's view, too personal. Too personal. The woman who had died in June 1887, Carver, checked the name against the list of 12 charity patients treated by Morrow. She was not on the list. She was the 13th woman, treated for the same condition, who had died under Morrow's direct care in the hospital, and whose death the hospital had formally attributed to causes that Morrow disputed. Everything began from her. The compass roses, the patient files, the visits to Flower and Dean Street, the notes, the murders, the letters, the 13-day countdown, everything. Carver sat very still for a moment, in the quiet that comes after a significant truth arrives. Then he wrote the dead woman's name in his notebook. Agnes Pryor, age 29, admitted June 3rd, died the 17th of June, 1887. He had 10 days left. He knew who he was looking for, and why, and how the crimes had been constructed. He still did not have a real name, a current address, or a face that could be matched to a description. He needed Holt. The journalist was at the Standard offices on Shoe Lane, and Carver arrived there at 2 o'clock without sending ahead. The newsroom was large, loud, and full of the particular competitive energy of men whose business is the trafficking of information. Holt met him in a private room off the main floor, small, paper-stacked, smelling of ink and cold coffee, and listened to what Carver told him with a stillness that increased as the account progressed. Agnes Pryor, Holt said, when Carver finished. I know that name. How? She was the subject of a letter to the editor that I chose not to publish, Holt said slowly. August of 1887. A letter submitted under a false name, but written with the same educated quality as the letters you've received. It was about the hospital system, the treatment of charity ward patients, the inadequacy of, he stopped. I set it aside because it was too specific about one case, and I couldn't verify the claims, and it read as the work of someone with a personal grievance rather than a journalistic argument. What name did it use? Holt crossed to a filing cabinet and spent 3 minutes working through it. He produced a folded letter, yellow at the edges. The signature at the bottom was Francis Morrow, and beneath it, drawn in miniature, a compass rose. He had been writing letters for over a year, to newspapers, to hospitals, to institutions. He had been building a record, a correspondence, a documented argument that no one had read with sufficient attention. He told you, in your letter, that you had published the answer, Carver said, on the 21st of September. The article about the witness on Flower and Dean Street. He looked at Holt directly. But there's something else in that article. Something you wrote that connects to Agnes Pryor's death in a way that you may not have recognized. Holt picked up the relevant edition. He read his own article with the focused attention of a man looking for something he wrote without knowing its full significance. He found it in the 8th paragraph. A general observation about the inadequacy of medical provision for East End women, drawn from conversations with 3 sources anonymous, as per his practice, which contained a phrase that he had written as a general social comment, but which, in the context Carver had now provided, took on a specific resonance. The women of Whitechapel, one source had told Holt, do not die of disease. They die of what we do not provide. Carver read the paraphrase in Holt's article. Then he read Holt's note in the margin of his own copy, written at some point after publication. Source 3, unusual precision for an anonymous tip. Source 3, Carver said. Holt's expression changed completely. He was your source, Carver said. He gave you that quote. He arranged for you to publish it. He was shaping the public record from both ends, the crimes and the journalism. I need to check something, Holt said, and his voice was very controlled. He opened the filing cabinet again and pulled a contact notebook, paging through it rapidly. He stopped at a page and showed it to Carver. A name, an address, in Whitechapel. Not a Harley Street address, not a hospital address. A room in a lodging house on Hanbury Street, noted as the contact address for Source 3, Mr. F. Morton. The same false name, slightly altered. He had been living on Hanbury Street, 3 minutes from the site of Annie Chapman's murder. He had been living 3 minutes from where he killed her. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Empty Room. The lodging house on Hanbury Street was a narrow 4-story building wedged between a bootmaker's shop and a chandler's warehouse, managed by a Mrs. Anne Clark, who answered the door at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, wearing an expression that suggested she had learned not to be surprised by police visits, but had not yet achieved complete equanimity about them. Mr. Morton, Carver said. 2nd floor, if the contact information is accurate. It was accurate. Mrs. Clark identified the second-floor front room immediately and led them upstairs that creaked with the specific protest of old timber that has carried too much weight for too many decades. She knocked and, receiving no answer, produced her key. The room had been vacated. Not recently, perhaps in the last 12 hours, but with what appeared to be deliberate thoroughness. The bed had been stripped. The small writing table had been cleared and wiped. The wardrobe was empty. The grate held the remnants of burnt paper, and Aberline crouched by it and turned the fragments carefully, retrieving 3 pieces that retained readable text. The fragments, laid out on the stripped mattress, read, "The girl who died was named, and then Char. Could not be permitted to continue, and then more Char. Carver will have understood by now. Char again." And then the final fragment, which was larger and had survived more completely. "Forgive me" is not the question. The question is whether it changes anything that I was right. Whether it changes anything that I was right. Carver read the fragment 3 times. Then he set it carefully in his evidence envelope. The room was small, barely adequate for one person, but it had been arranged by its occupant with a particular kind of austere precision. The window gave onto the backyard rather than the street, a choice of room, Carver guessed, that had been deliberate, allowing him to observe the yard and the passage beyond without being visible from the front. The wall beside the writing table bore faint rectangular marks where papers had been pinned and removed. There was a faint smell of carbolic in the room, the surgeon's habit. Antiseptic discipline maintained even in a Whitechapel lodging room. And on the inside of the wardrobe door, left there deliberately or simply forgotten in the final clearance, was a page torn from a medical journal. An article from a German publication, 1885, concerning surgical outcomes in charity hospitals. The margins were densely annotated in the educated hand. The annotations were in English, and in another language Carver took to be German. He gave the page to Phillips, who had accompanied them. Phillips read the marginalia in silence. His expression changed in stages, settling into something that was simultaneously sad and appalled. "He's annotated mortality statistics," Phillips said quietly. "From charity wards across London, Berlin, Vienna. He's comparing outcomes by social class. He's built a statistical argument that," he paused, seeming to measure his words, "that the mortality rate among charity patients with this specific condition is 20 times higher than among private patients with the same condition, attributable not to medical factors, but to pre-existing poverty and the conditions that produced the condition in the first place." He looked up from the page. "He was constructing a public health argument in the margins of a medical journal article in a lodging house room in Hanbury Street. While killing women," Aberline said. "While killing women," Phillips agreed and looked down at the page again as if hoping it would make more sense on second examination. Mrs. Clark provided a description of Mr. Morton that matched Clara Dowd's description of the man on Flower and Dean Street with a fidelity that confirmed beyond doubt they were the same person. He had lived in her house for 8 months. He had been a quiet lodger, punctual with his rent, causing no disturbances. He received no visitors. He went out daily, sometimes at unusual hours. He had twice returned with what she had taken to be blood on his coat, which he had explained as the consequence of treating a street accident. She had believed this because it was not an implausible explanation for a medical man, and because she admitted with evident discomfort, not particularly wished to pursue the alternative. "People don't want to know," she said, not defensively, but with the weariness of someone making an accurate observation. "You ask yourself whether you want to know, and mostly the answer is no, especially now in Whitechapel, especially this year." Carver did not argue with this. He had spent 4 weeks watching an entire city simultaneously demand to know and refuse to know, and Mrs. Clark's private calculation seemed to him simply an honest version of a collective one. He asked whether Morton had left anything else, anything she had not already shown them. She produced, from a pocket of her apron, a single item she had found on the kitchen table that morning, addressed in the familiar hand. "For Mrs. Clark, with apologies for the disruption of my departure." Inside the envelope was a week's rent in advance, precisely calculated, and a small folded note that read, "The inspector will be here by 4 o'clock. Please answer his questions honestly. I have caused you no permanent harm. Tell him that I was not what Whitechapel will remember." He had expected them by 4 o'clock. He had left a message for them with his landlady. He had calculated their arrival time and still managed to be gone before it. He was, Carver thought, either the most organized person he had ever investigated or the most desperate, or in a way that he was beginning to understand both simultaneously. I was not what Whitechapel will remember. He would not be remembered as a surgeon, as a man who had spent 8 months treating women in a charity ward with genuine competence and, apparently, genuine anguish at the limitations of what he could repair. He would be remembered as a monster, as the name that London had made legendary through 8 weeks of horror. He knew this. He had written the line with the full knowledge of what history would retain. And still, he had done it. Or believed he had done it for a reason that transcended what history would say. The tobacco shop near Mitre Square provided the first solid physical lead. Aberline found it, working through the lists of continental tobacco suppliers in the East End, and arrived at the shop at 5 o'clock with a constable and the specific scent description that Constable Quill had included in his supplementary report. The proprietor, a small, careful man named Werner, who had been selling tobacco from that location for 12 years, identified the blend immediately. "It is a specific mixture," he said. "I make it only for 3 customers. It is a Viennese blend, quite distinctive. I learned the recipe from my own supplier in Vienna." He pulled a ledger. 3 customers. Mr. Hoffman, who is a silversmith on Aldgate. Mr. Krebs, who is a pawnbroker on Mile End Road. And he paused over the ledger. Mr. Friedrich Maurer, who, he looked up, has not collected his regular weekly supply for the past 3 weeks. Friedrich, F. The initial matched. Morrow, Morton, Maurer. "The name," Carver said. "Friedrich Maurer. When he came to collect his tobacco, did he pay with coins or notes? Did he leave any other name, any address for delivery?" "He always paid in coin. No delivery he collected in person." Werner closed the ledger. "But there was a card. He left a card when he first came, in case I needed to contact him." The card was filed behind the counter, beneath a tray of pipe fittings. It bore an address, not Hanbury Street, not Harley Street, but a street in Bethnal Green that Carver did not immediately recognize. And below the address, the card bore a professional title. Not surgeon, not physician, not Dr. F. Morrow. Dr. Friedrich Maurer, lecturer in surgical sciences, University of Leipzig. The real name, the actual credentials, the institution. Haberline sent a telegram to Leipzig within the hour. The reply from Leipzig arrived at 11 o'clock that evening, sooner than any reply from a German institution had any right to arrive, which suggested either that someone in Leipzig had been expecting the inquiry, or that the particular recipient of Aberline's telegraph had been waiting for it. The telegram read, "Dr. Friedrich Maurer, age 44, formerly lecturer surgical sciences. This university, full stop, departed position, October 1884, following personal circumstances, full stop. We were informed of his death in London, November 1887. Full stop. If he is alive, we wish to know full stop. Please advise, stop, Professor E. Kranz." Carver read this and reread it. He read it a third time. November 1887. 3 months after Morrow left the London hospital, someone had informed Leipzig that Friedrich Maurer was dead. Maurer himself, presumably. He had, after leaving the hospital, staged his own death, a reported death, at minimum. Official enough to reach his former university in order to complete whatever transformation had been occurring in him since Agnes Pryor died in June 1887. He had killed himself, in the administrative sense. Friedrich Maurer was dead. Dr. F. Morrow took the Hanbury Street room and began the visits to Flower and Dean Street, which raised a question that now had terrible weight. If Friedrich Maurer was officially dead, was there any document trail, any administrative record, any correspondence through which he could be identified and located in his current incarnation? Ellen Pye had not been found. She had now been missing for 24 hours. 9 days remained until the 14th of October. Carver sent a second telegram to Professor E. Kranz in Leipzig, asking for everything. Then he sat in the evidence room and looked at the wall and thought about a man who had decided, at some point in 1887, that his own death was a prerequisite for what came next. Who had systematically liquidated his identity, his professional standing, his institutional existence, in order to become someone who could move through Whitechapel unseen. who had moved into a lodging house 3 minutes from the site of his first murder and lived there for 8 months, surrounded by people who knew him as a quiet man with unusual hours and blood on his coat. What he could not determine, and this had been bothering him since he first read the letter, was the full significance of the countdown. 10 days. Not because he believed Maurer intended to kill again on the 14th, but because the 14th was significant for another reason that he had not yet identified. He opened the calendar on the duty sergeant's desk. The 14th of October, 1888. He counted backward. He counted forward. He looked for historical significance, for legal significance, for institutional significance. And then, very quietly, he found it. The 14th of October was the date of the inquest conclusion for Agnes Pryor, delayed repeatedly through 1887 and 1888 for administrative reasons, currently scheduled to deliver its formal verdict on the question of how Agnes Pryor had died. The inquest verdict that would officially record or officially suppress the question of institutional responsibility for her death. The inquest verdict that the London Hospitals Board had spent 14 months attempting to ensure reached a particular conclusion. Maurer had not given Carver 14 days to find a killer. He had given Carver 14 days to find a truth before a different verdict made it legally irrelevant. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Inquest. The Agnes Pryor inquest had been opened in June 1887, the week after her death, and had immediately been suspended pending additional medical testimony that had, for 14 months, failed to materialize. The Whitechapel coroner, Mr. Wynne Baxter, who was, as it happened, the same coroner who had presided over the inquests of the Ripper victims, giving him a particularly extraordinary relationship to this entire sequence of events, had grown visibly impatient with the delays and had, in August of 1888, set the final date of October 14th as an absolute deadline. Carver obtained the inquest file at 9 o'clock the following morning and spent 2 hours with it. Agnes Pryor had been 29 years old. She had been admitted to the London Hospital on the 3rd of June, 1887, in acute distress, following a procedure that had been performed not at any licensed medical establishment, but at an address in Stepney, which, the police report noted, was currently occupied by a laundress and had previously been occupied by a series of unnamed individuals. She had been treated by Dr. Friedrich Maurer in the charity ward for 14 days, during which she had initially improved and then suddenly deteriorated. On the 17th of June, she had died. The question before the inquest never formally answered was whether the contributing factors to her death included the inadequacy of the post-operative care environment, the delay in her initial admission to professional treatment, or anything related to the specific treatment approach used by the hospital. The hospital's position, maintained through 14 months of administrative delay, was that the cause of death was solely the prior procedure and its complications, entirely predating her admission. Maurer's position, expressed in a formal letter to the coroner submitted in July 1887 and included in the file, was that while the prior procedure had undoubtedly caused the initial damage, Agnes Pryor's death had been preventable if she had had access to timely professional care rather than being driven by poverty and necessity to an unlicensed practitioner. Her death was not a medical tragedy, his letter argued, but a social one, and any verdict that failed to reflect this would be a document of institutional convenience rather than medical truth. The letter was signed, Friedrich Maurer, FRCS, and in the lower margin, almost as small as those on the evidence items but unmistakably the same, a compass rose. He had been signing his letters with compass roses since Agnes Pryor died. Carver understood the symbol now. Not merely a signature, not merely a marker placed in evidence to guide the investigation. A compass rose points in all directions simultaneously. It is a symbol of navigation, of finding your bearing when all directions look alike. The man who had been Friedrich Maurer had signed every document of his hidden life with the symbol of someone who knows where he is going and intends to arrive. The question of who had delayed the inquest was easier to answer than Carver had expected once he knew what to look for. The delays had been requested, in formal correspondence, by the hospital's solicitor, a firm called Merrifield & Sons, 24 Chancery Lane, whose senior partner was a Mr. Thomas Merrifield. The grounds for each delay had varied. Additional medical testimony was being prepared. A relevant witness was unavailable. Administrative scheduling conflicts, but they had been consistent in their effect. and consistent in their direction. Mr. Thomas Merrifield was a distinguished solicitor with no criminal record and an immaculate professional reputation. He was also, as Carver discovered through an hour's work in the professional directories, the personal solicitor of several members of the London Hospital's Board of Governors. Conflict of interest was not the same as conspiracy. Institutional self-protection through legal delay was not the same as deliberate suppression of evidence. Carver was conscious, as he assembled these facts, that he was looking at a picture whose outlines were suggestive without being conclusive, and that a jury or a newspaper might draw very different lines through the same points. But Maurer had drawn his own lines, with a surgeon's precision, and the lines led back here, to Agnes Pryor, to the hospital, to a verdict that was 8 days away. He sent a note to the inquest coroner, Wynne Baxter, requesting an urgent meeting. Then he went to find Clarence Holt. The journalist was already at Lehman Street Station when Carver returned, having apparently anticipated the summons with the same professional instinct that had made him useful throughout the investigation. He sat in the briefing room with a notebook open and the expression of a man who has not slept much but is running on something better than sleep. Carver sat down across from him and spent 20 minutes telling him everything, with the exception of Ellen Pye's name and location, or rather, the lack of known location, and the specific nature of the condition that had connected the victims, which he was not yet prepared to have published. Holt listened with complete attention. When Carver finished, the journalist was quiet for nearly a full minute. "You're asking me to publish something," Holt said. "I'm asking you to be prepared to publish something, on a specific date, with specific emphasis on the Agnes Pryor inquest and its significance. The 14th. The story needs to be ready by the 14th. Before the inquest verdict is delivered, the verdict will be influenced by what the public knows about the reasons for the delay." Holt understood. Public knowledge, published in the newspapers before a coroner's jury delivered its verdict, would make the verdict of institutional convenience considerably harder to deliver. Not impossible. Juries were not bound by newspaper opinion, but harder, and the record would be clearer. "He planned this," Holt said. "The murders, the letters, the countdown. He's not asking to be caught, Inspector. He's asking to be caught in a way that forces this story into the public record before it can be suppressed." "Yes," Carver said. "The women who died," Holt said carefully. "Were they instrumental to this? Or did he genuinely believe, in his distorted reasoning, that what he did to them was connected to Agnes Pryor's death in a way that—" "I think," Carver said, and chose his words with extreme care, "that the distortion was genuine. That Friedrich Maurer, after Agnes Pryor's death, underwent a collapse of moral reasoning that was not cynical or performative, but genuine. He genuinely believed, in some part of himself that had ceased to function normally, that what he was doing constituted a form of justice. And I also think," he paused, "that there is a small residue of rational observation buried inside the distortion, which is that the conditions that killed Agnes Pryor are real. The institutional failures are real. The things he documented in that Leipzig journal margin are real, and he used real horror to make a real argument." "Yes, and the real argument doesn't become false because of the horror." "No," Carver said, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. "Ellen Pye," Carver said. "The second remaining patient. We haven't found her. If she comes to light through the investigation, if anyone reading your future article has information—" "I'll handle it," Holt said. Wynne Baxter met Carver at his chambers at 4 o'clock. He was a man with an extraordinary mustache and a precise legal mind, and he received the briefing on the Agnes Pryor inquest delay with the expression of a coroner who has been suspected of being managed and deeply resented it. "The delays were requested through proper channels," he said stiffly. "I have no authority to refuse properly documented applications." "I know," Carver said. "I'm not suggesting you acted improperly. I'm asking whether, given new information regarding the potential connection between these delays and the Whitechapel murder investigation, you would be willing to hear additional medical testimony before the 14th. "What additional testimony?" "From the physician who treated Agnes Pryor," Carver said. and who has, I believe, been attempting to place his medical analysis of her death into the public record through every means available to him for the past 14 months. Baxter was silent for a moment. The physician who treated her was a Dr. Maurer, who I was told had died. He is not dead, Carver said. Baxter looked at him for a long time. Inspector, are you telling me that the man you're investigating for the Whitechapel murders wishes to give medical testimony at the inquest of a patient who died under his care? Yes, Carver said. And I believe his testimony would be medically significant, and I believe that is precisely why the inquest has been delayed for 14 months. He found the note when he returned to Leman Street Station at 5:30. It was on the duty sergeant's desk, addressed to him. Delivered by hand, a constable had accepted it from a street boy who had been paid 6 pence to deliver it and had not seen who paid him. The envelope contained two things: a compass rose drawn on plain paper and an address on Commercial Street with a time 11 o'clock tonight. And below the time, 4 words: "Bring a doctor, please." End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. The Final Night. The fog that descended on Whitechapel that evening was of the particular density that London produces only in October, when the Thames moisture meets the coal smoke from 10,000 chimneys and the temperature drops far enough for the mixture to thicken into something almost solid. Gas lamps became amber blurs, visible only from within a 10-foot radius. Footsteps were swallowed before they traveled a yard. The streets that Carver walked from Leman Street to Commercial Street were as familiar to him by this point as the corridors of Scotland Yard, and still the fog made them alien, reduced them to a succession of dimly perceived shapes: a doorway, a cartwheel, a woman moving quickly with her head down, that resolved into themselves only at close range. He brought Phillips. He brought Aberline over his initial objection. He brought 2 constables who were told to station themselves at both ends of the relevant address and not enter under any circumstances until called. He did not bring Commissioner Warren. The address was a warehouse on Commercial Street, partially vacant, used for the storage of textile goods. The building's front entrance was locked, but the side door, a wooden door set into the brick, old enough to have warped slightly out of its frame, was unlocked and opened at a touch. Inside, the warehouse smell was thick: wool dust, damp timber, something chemical from old dyeing processes. The building was partitioned into storage bays, most currently empty. In the third bay from the entrance, a paraffin lamp had been placed on a crate, producing a circle of warm light that was barely adequate but sufficient. In the light of that lamp sat Ellen Pye and Friedrich Maurer. Ellen Pye was alive, wrapped in a coat that was not hers, seated on a packing case with the expression of a woman who has passed through terror into a kind of exhausted acceptance. She was not bound. She was not obviously harmed. She held a tin cup that appeared to contain tea, and she looked at Carver when he entered with the first genuinely relieved expression he had seen on anyone's face in weeks. Friedrich Maurer sat on the opposite side of the lamp from her. He was exactly as described: tall, angular, clean-shaven, with pale, attentive eyes that moved from Carver to Phillips to Aberline with the careful attention of a man who has been expecting precisely this arrival and is confirming that it matches his expectations. He looked, Carver thought, exhausted. Not the sudden exhaustion of a man who has been running and been caught, but the deep exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has arrived, at last, at the place where he can set it down. "Inspector Carver," he said. His English was fluent, but the continental accent was audible, the Viennese roots. Holt's witness had noted, the German medical training overlaid on it. "I asked you to bring a doctor, not to attend to me. She's been here 2 days and she's frightened, and she deserves attention." Phillips crossed to Ellen Pye immediately and began the quiet, methodical assessment of someone who takes care of people as a first instinct. Maurer watched this, and something in his face changed very slightly, not softened exactly, but settled. "You've been protecting her," Carver said. "You've had her here because you were afraid that when the investigation closed in, someone, the hospital's legal representation, or someone connected to them might reach her first. She's the last witness who can testify to the specific connection between the hospital's procedures and the conditions that Agnes Pryor arrived with," Maurer said. "She used the same unlicensed practitioner. She survived. She can speak to the conditions. If she could not be found, or if she were frightened into silence—" "She's been frightened into silence anyway," Carver said. "By you?" "Yes. No flinching from this. I managed the situation badly. She saw me on Dorset Street 2 weeks ago and recognized me from the soup kitchen, from the charity ward, and I could not allow her to be found by anyone before you had sufficient evidence to proceed. So I brought her here. I left you the address as soon as I was certain you had what you needed." He looked at Carver steadily. "I gave you the information to find everything. I gave you Agnes Pryor's name. I gave you the inquest timeline. I gave you the hospital records. I gave you Holt's article, and the tobacconist, and the lodging house. I gave you every piece." "You gave me 4 dead women," Carver said. The statement landed in the lamplight between them and did not dissipate. Maurer's expression did not change. He sat with the words in the way that a man sits with a truth he has already lived with for a long time, and that no addition to it can make worse. "Yes?" he said. "Tell me why." "You know why," Maurer said. "You have the file. You have the records. You know what Agnes Pryor's death meant, and what it represented, and what it was connected to. You know that I tried to make that argument through every available legitimate channel for a year. The hospital board, the coroner, the medical journals, the newspapers, and found each channel closed, delayed, dismissed, or simply unread." His voice remained level throughout this. "I am not going to claim that what I did was rational. I am not going to claim that it was the only option. I am going to claim that it was the product of a mind that had passed a certain threshold and could not find its way back, and that within that mind there existed a conviction which I believe is factually correct, even as I recognize that my method of expressing it was not that Agnes Pryor's death and the deaths of women like her would continue indefinitely until someone created a situation in which the truth could not be ignored." "And the women you killed," Carver said, "Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, did you believe you were helping them?" A long silence. The paraffin lamp flickered. "I believe they were already dying," Maurer said finally. "By the same mechanism that killed Agnes Pryor." "I believed—" He stopped. "I believed a great many things that do not survive contact with the simplest moral examination. I know that. I have known it, in some part of myself, since the first night. It did not stop me." "Why not?" He looked directly at Carver. "Because I had already stopped being the person who could be stopped by that knowledge. Aberline, who had been standing near the entrance with the controlled stillness of a detective who has learned to let an interview proceed without interference, moved slightly. "You'll come with us," he said. "It was not a question." "Of course," Maurer said. He stood with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has prepared for this moment extensively. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a thick envelope. "For the inquest coroner, the complete medical analysis of Agnes Pryor's case, and documentation of the specific treatment chain that led to the conditions she arrived with at the hospital. Signed in my real name. I'll testify at the inquest." "You'll be in custody by then," Aberline said. "I'll testify in custody," Maurer said. "Whatever the legal arrangements require. The testimony is more important than the arrangements." Phillips, completing his assessment of Ellen Pye, straightened up and looked across the lamp at Maurer with an expression that Carver could not entirely read. It was not sympathy, precisely. It was something more complicated, the expression of a physician recognizing in another physician a catastrophic failure that he cannot simply explain as madness, because too much of the reasoning is coherent. "She's unharmed," Philip said. "Frightened, cold, hungry. She'll be all right." Ellen Pye looked at Maurer. "You brought me tea," she said, with the slightly disoriented air of someone who has been trying to make sense of an experience that resists categorization. "Every morning. You brought me tea and told me it would be finished soon." Maurer nodded. "What was he like?" she asked Carver. "Before, when he was at the hospital." Carver had not known him before. He did not answer. "He was kind," Ellen Pye said, apparently to herself. "He was the kindest doctor I ever saw. He sat with Agnes for hours. He held her hand when she was frightened. He told her she was going to be all right." She looked at the man across the lamp. "When did that stop? When did you stop being him?" Maurer was quiet for a long time. "I'm not certain I did," he said. "I'm not certain that's how it works." Carver took the envelope for Baxter, put it in his coat, and nodded to Aberline. They brought Friedrich Maurer through the foggy streets of Whitechapel at midnight, through the city he had inhabited for the past year under layers of false names, past the lodging houses and markets and soup kitchens and the streets where he had walked among the people he had spent those months caring for and then catastrophically failing. The fog hid everything beyond 10 feet in any direction, so that the world contracted to a small circle of cobblestones and the occasional amber blur of a gas lamp, and Whitechapel, which had been a living character in this story all along, a place whose hunger and fear and exhaustion had both produced and been exploited by everything that occurred, reduced itself to footsteps and breathing, and the distant moan of a foghorn on the invisible Thames. No one on the streets that night knew that the man walking between two detectives, quietly, without resistance, with an envelope in the custody of the detective beside him, that would be the most important document at a legal proceeding, 8 days hence, was the person who had consumed London's imagination for 8 weeks. The legend was already too large. The man inside it was too specific, too sad, too human, too terrible. At the corner of Commercial Street and Whitechapel High Street, Maurer stopped walking for a moment. Aberline's hand went to his arm, but Maurer was simply looking upward at the blank, dark sky above the fog. "The women from the hospital," he said. "The ones who are still alive. The other 6. He looked at Carver. "Will you look into their situations?" "Not because of me. Because their situations are likely unchanged from Agnes Pryor's." "Walk," Aberline said. Maurer walked. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. The Verdict. The Agnes Pryor inquest concluded on the 14th of October, 1888. It concluded after 3 days of testimony, with a verdict that the coroner's jury reached in 4 hours, and that was, by any measure, a more honest document than the 14 months of delay had seemed likely to produce. The verdict found that while the primary cause of Agnes Pryor's death was the complications arising from an unlicensed procedure she had been driven to seek through poverty and the unavailability of timely legitimate care, contributing factors included the inadequacy of charitable medical provision in the East End and the delay in her admission to professional treatment that was itself the consequence of conditions well known to public authorities. It was not the verdict the London Hospitals Board had spent 14 months preparing for. Their solicitor, Mr. Merrifield, was observed leaving the coroner's court with an expression that required no interpretation. The Evening Standard published Clarence Holt's article, The Full Account, which he had been preparing for 12 days on the morning of the 14th, before the verdict. The article detailed the connection between the charity ward patients, the identity of the man who had treated them, the medical argument he had spent a year trying to place into the public record, and the catastrophic course that argument had taken. It was the best piece of journalism Holt had produced in his career by his own later assessment, and also the piece that cost him the most, because it demanded of him a moral precision that good journalism requires and that most journalism finds ways to avoid, namely, the precision of holding two true things simultaneously without resolving them into a comfortable synthesis, that the argument was substantially correct, and that the method of making it was indefensible. Both things were true. They remained both true regardless of how uncomfortable that combination was. Commissioner Warren summoned Carver to Scotland Yard on the morning of the 15th and offered him a commendation, an advancement in grade, and the implicit understanding that certain aspects of the investigation's findings, specifically those bearing on the London Hospital's institutional practices and the Agnes Prior inquest delays, would be managed with discretion. Carver declined the advancement in grade, which he was entitled to decline, and accepted the commendation, which he was not in a position to refuse. He did not respond to the implicit understanding about discretion, because he had already given Holt the full account, and it was in print. Warren did not appear surprised by this. He appeared resigned to it, in the manner of an official who has concluded that a certain class of honest man is more trouble than he is worth, and is nonetheless compelled to employ him. Dr. Heinrich Strauss returned to his surgical practice at the London Hospital 10 days after the Times letter had named him, having spent those 10 days in a state of enforced domestic imprisonment while the correct name replaced his in the newspapers. He resumed his work without public comment, having consulted with his solicitor about the possibility of action against the newspaper for defamation, and having been told that such action, while potentially successful, would prolong his public association with the case beyond what his professional reputation could comfortably absorb. He chose not to pursue it. He did, however, submit a letter to the medical journal, The Lancet, in November of 1888, arguing for improvements to the charitable medical provision for women in the East End of London. The letter cited several statistical analyses of mortality disparities. The analyses were drawn from sources that Strauss attributed only to a colleague's research. Whether the professional community recognized whose research he was drawing on was not recorded. George Lusk received a personal letter from Carver in the third week of October, thanking the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee for their cooperation during the investigation and acknowledging specifically the utility of their intelligence about the Flower and Dean Street Soup Kitchen register. Lusk read the letter to his committee at their next meeting. The committee continued its patrols through the winter of 1888, gradually reducing in frequency as Whitechapel's particular atmosphere of siege began, very slowly, to dissipate. Clara Dowd returned to her position at the laundry and told Mrs. Henniker she had recovered from her illness. She did not speak publicly about her role in the investigation, having judged correctly, by any reasonable assessment that her testimony had been given in the appropriate forum and that the additional attention of newspaper celebrity would benefit her nothing. She continued bringing soup to Mrs. Potts on the third floor of number 4 every Tuesday and Friday for the next 3 years. Ellen Pye gave testimony at the Agnes Prior inquest in the composed and careful manner of a woman who has been frightened to the limits of her composure and has decided that the limits are further out than she previously believed. Her testimony was the clearest account available of the conditions that connected the charity ward patients, and the coroner's jury listened to it with the concentrated attention it deserved. Friedrich Maurer was committed to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum on the 2nd of November, 1888, following a formal legal determination that he was not responsible for his actions by reason of the insanity that the court found had governed his conduct during the period in question. This was not a surprising legal conclusion, given the evidence. It was not an unsatisfying one for those who believe that punishment is best directed at those capable of understanding it. Whether Maurer himself found it satisfying is not recorded. He was, by all accounts, a cooperative inmate. He continued writing medical papers, which the asylum permitted him to do, and which were occasionally published, under a pseudonym, in minor medical journals. Whether the compass rose appeared in the margins of those papers was not a matter that reached any official record. He was not Jack the Ripper, as history would remember Jack the Ripper. History would remember a figure of abstract evil, a shadow without a face, a legend whose power derived precisely from its incompleteness. Friedrich Maurer was too specific for that legend, too educated, too sad, too driven by a grief that had curdled into something he could not control. The legend required a monster, and Maurer was not a monster. He was something considerably harder to contemplate, a man. Carver wrote his final case report in the second week of November. It was a thorough document, precisely organized, evidentially careful. It included everything: the 12 patients, the Agnes Pryor connection, the hospital delay, the letters, the compass roses, the false names, the inquest, the outcome. It was filed at Scotland Yard, where it was classified and where it remained, accessible in theory to anyone with appropriate authorization. In practice, read by approximately 6 people over the following decade. The case of the Whitechapel murders, in its public form, remained officially unsolved. It remained officially unsolved for reasons that were not entirely bureaucratic convenience, though bureaucratic convenience was certainly present. It remained unsolved partly because Maurer's legal status as criminally insane meant that his formal identification as the Whitechapel killer was a matter of medical and legal jurisdiction rather than criminal conviction. It remained unsolved partly because no official wanted to publish the full account of the Agnes Pryor inquest and its implications for London's charity hospital system. And it remained unsolved partly because the legend had already grown beyond any particular man, had become something that the city needed, in some obscure way, to remain unresolved, as though the uncertainty itself contained a warning that a named and confined suspect did not. Whether the legend served any useful purpose is a question without a comfortable answer. On a Tuesday evening in late November, Carver walked through Whitechapel for the first time since the case had concluded. With no professional purpose, in the early dark that comes in November, when the days have shortened to something barely distinguishable from night, the fog was lighter than October's. The gas lamps were more visible. The streets had recovered something not quite normality, not quite the atmosphere of an ordinary city, but something closer to both than they had possessed for 3 months. Women moved through the streets in ones and twos, not singly, still cautious, still changed by what autumn had done to them. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee's civilian patrol crossed Carver's path near the corner of Commercial Street. He recognized one of the men and nodded, and was nodded at in return. He passed the soup kitchen on Flower and Dean Street, closed at this hour but still showing light in its back window, someone preparing for the morning, setting up the registers and the bread orders. He thought of Frances Haig and her visitor ledger, and the entry for Dr. F. Morrow, and the care with which Maurer had constructed his false identity while leaving, at every step, something that could be followed. He had wanted to be followed. He had wanted it so intensely that he had engineered an entire investigative path, placing markers along it like a man leaving a trail through a wood he knew better than his pursuer. And the reason he had wanted it was not the reason a vain man wants recognition, or even the reason a guilty man wants confession. It was the reason of someone who had concluded that the only medium left capable of publishing his argument was the investigation of his own crimes. Whether it changes anything that I was right, he had been right about the conditions. The conditions were real, were documented, were the subject of a coroner's inquest verdict that now existed in the public record. Whether the verdict changed anything remained to be seen. The Early Morning Herald had published 3 articles in October about the Pryor case and the East End Charity Hospital system. A parliamentary question had been asked and had received an official answer that was carefully non-committal. A committee had been proposed to examine conditions in East End charitable institutions. Committees, in Carver's experience, were how governments converted urgent problems into deferrable schedules, but they were also, occasionally, the first step towards something real. Whether something real would follow was not something Edmund Carver could control. It was not, he reflected, something Friedrich Maurer could have controlled either, regardless of what he had done. He reached the end of Flower and Dean Street and turned toward Commercial Road, and the fog that had been light for the past hour thickened again suddenly, as London's fog does, without announcement, reducing the street to the familiar amber blur of gas lamps dissolving in grey air. Somewhere ahead, a church bell struck the hour street. Botolph's, he thought, by the timbre and the sound, travelled through the fog and arrived at him, slightly softened, slightly changed by the distance. He counted the strokes. 8 o'clock. The city of Whitechapel, which had spent 3 months living under a fear that had become legendary before it was fully understood, breathed around him in the dark. It breathed with the specific exhaustion of a place that has survived something and has not yet determined what surviving it costs. The lodging houses were lit. The pubs were full. The markets would open at dawn, and the factories would start their noise, and the soup kitchens would register their visitors, and the newspaper vendors would cry the day's headlines, and the whole enormous ordinary machine of a city that could not stop would continue. Whatever had happened in its streets this autumn would remain in those streets, absorbed into the stones and the fog, becoming part of the city's memory, even as the specific truth of it receded into official files and legal classifications, and the permanent uncertainty that public legend requires. Jack the Ripper would be remembered. Friedrich Maurer would not. Agnes Pryor would not. Whether that was an injustice or simply the nature of how history works, how it consumes specific truths and produces general symbols, how it remembers what terrified without always remembering why Carver could not determine, standing on Commercial Road in the November fog, with his left hand motionless in his coat pocket and the church bell fading into the dark. He could determine only that he had found what there was to find, and that finding it had not been sufficient to save everyone it might have saved, and that this was the condition that all honest investigation eventually arrives at. The truth arrived late, and some of the cost of its lateness was irrecoverable. He walked home through Whitechapel, and the fog closed behind him as he went, and the city resumed its dreaming, and the gas lamps burned through the night as they always burned, insufficient and steady, against the dark. The Agnes Pryor inquest verdict was filed with the public record on the 14th of October, 1888. It remains to this day a document that very few people have read. The Whitechapel murders of 1888 remain officially unsolved. Friedrich Maurer died at Broadmoor in 1903, at the age of 59. Having outlived Agnes Pryor by 16 years. His compass roses have never been formally identified as a signature. They appear in 4 separate locations in the public record of the investigation, each as small as a thumbnail, each as precise as a wound. History remembers the legend. The legend remembers only the fear. The truth, as truth so often does, waited quietly in the files, marked with a symbol pointing in all directions at once, for anyone willing to find it. And,